Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Today's topic is a lecture on Brazil, South America in 1987. In 1987, I was working at Myers, Henneman, Schneider and Ray law firm in Cleveland, Ohio, USA, located in the Superior Building, East 9th and Superior. And my father was a founding partner and a lawyer at the time, John S. Ray. I was a clerk. And anyway, around this was maybe the early summer of 1987, I decided I wanted to be a high school history teacher. And I thought, I'd heard that you could get a job without a license, without a certificate. So I thought, well, maybe I'll put together a resume and I'll make a video showing myself teaching, and see what happens. See if I can get a job. Well, I never pursued that, and that fall I started taking classes at Cleveland State University. 2 years later, I got a teaching job in Gstaad, Switzerland, teaching high school history and other subtopics. And so this is actually a beginning, sort of an early attempt at me at teaching. And now the movie, folks. Good afternoon, and welcome to another lecture in world history. Today we'll be discussing Brazil, and the title of our lecture is The Afro-Indo-European History of Brazil, or more specifically perhaps the Afro-Indo-Portuguese history of Brazil. Now, Brazil is the largest country in South America, largest country in all of Latin America, in fact. It is larger than Australia, but slightly smaller than the continental United States. In terms of size, that means it's approximately 3.25 million square miles. Much of the island is coastline, and it has a 4,600-mile coastline which fronts on the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. The equator runs through Brazil, and it's a very hot climate down there and tropical, with a lot of rainfall. So it's basically a hot and wet country. Brazil has vast mineral wealth, and much of it is yet to be exploited. Gold, iron ore, coal, silver, copper, and zinc are among the natural resources of Brazil. Some of the industries which she possesses are food processing, textiles, which means the manufacture of cloth and clothing, chemical products, the building of ships, cigars, rum, and in recent years they've been developing a steel industry. When we think of Brazil, a lot of times people think of the Amazon River Valley. And in that area, in the Amazon River Valley, the largest forests in the world are in this part of our world. It's a very tropical area and dense with foliage. And it's not developed for agriculture, nor particularly suitable, which generally tropical rainforests are not throughout our world, because the soil is not suitable. It's not there's not an adequate depth of soil to produce agriculture over an extended period of time. Perhaps for a few years, slash and burn agriculture could be utilized, and indeed the Indians did in South America before the arrival of Europeans. However, timber has been extracted from the Amazon River Valley and continues to be. Most of the farming is in the southeast portion of the country, where there are large coffee plantations. Brazil is the #1 producer of coffee in the entire world. So the chances are, if you're drinking a cup of coffee, it could have come from there. Other agricultural products are sugarcane, cotton, tobacco, rice, corn, potatoes, beans, yams, and other vegetables. Cattle as well as horses are raised in Brazil. Some of the natural flora or plant life in Brazil include mangoes, palm trees, rubber trees, and cinnamon. Outside of the Amazon area, there are prairies further to the west and in the south. Now, I don't have a map with me here, but if you can imagine and visualize the South American continent, Brazil is very large. It occupies most of the continent of South America. And the Amazon River flows, the mouth of the Amazon is in the northern part of the country. It flows into the off the north coast, and from east to west across the country in the northern area. Some of the animal life in Brazil, primarily in the tropical areas of the Amazon River Valley, are the puma, the jaguar, many species of monkeys, deer, anteaters, opossums, boa constrictors, rattlesnakes, as well as armadillos. Now, on that note, for those of you who are soccer fans and are aware of, who follow the Cleveland Force, perhaps you've heard of the gentleman by the name of Tattoo, who plays for the Dallas Sidekicks, and who was largely responsible for the elimination of Cleveland from the soccer playoffs. Now, his name is Tattoo. He's from Brazil. And Tattoo in Portuguese is armadillo. And that's, so that's very interesting. He has this nickname of the armadillo Tattoo, and there are many armadillos in Brazil. Some of the fish now in the Amazon River itself, they have a wide variety of tropical fish, many of which are raised for United States consumption, not exactly consumption, but raised for pet lovers in this country, those who have aquariums for tropical fish. Angelfish are in this river, the Amazon. There are piranhas. I'm sure you're aware of the stories of piranhas, people who have been eaten alive in a matter of minutes entirely by schools of piranhas. In this area, there are also macaws, green parrots, and those types of birds, which many people do have as pets. Nowadays, the transportation network in Brazil consists of railroads, of which there are over 20,000 miles, inland waterways, about the same number of mileage, which are navigable, many of which are linked to the Amazon River. 160,000 miles of highways have been paved as well. The trade of Brazil nowadays is primarily with the United States, West Germany, Argentina, which is her large competitor neighbor to the south, France, as well as Britain. Now, coffee is traditionally been the #1 export for Brazil, although in recent years other heavy industries are taking more and more of the coffee share of the export income. Brazil imports diesel oil, gasoline, wheat, flour, and cars. The population of Brazil is the majority is of white Portuguese ancestry, Hispanic. 20% of the people are mulatto, which means their ancestors are both European as well as African, and about 10% of the people are black, and a smaller percent are Indians. Vast majority of the people are Roman Catholic, over 90%. The capital of Brazil today is Brasilia, which is a man-made capital, or rather an artificial capital, which was created in the interior with the attempt to unite the country. Whereas in former times they've had several capitals. In former times the capitals were all on the seacoast, and the building of a capital inside in the inlands was trying to was an attempt by the government to try to develop the interior. Let's see. Some people have described, perhaps tourists or visitors have described Brazil as a paradise. And indeed, Brazil has tremendous possibilities for the future, and it's one of the countries in the third world that has a lot of possibilities for becoming powerful and generating income and raising the standard of living of their people, while contributing a very colorful culture to our world. 1/3 of the territory of Latin America, as well as the population of the entire Latin America, is Brazilian. Now, when I speak of Latin America, I'm talking primarily about from Mexico all the way down to the south, near the South Pole. All of South America and Central America and much of the Caribbean is a Latin-speaking area. Given this condition, it's still very few of us Americans know very much about Brazil. It's not widely reported in the news. So I think it's considering its size and so forth, it's very much worthwhile learning about Brazil. First of all, getting into the history of the country, it's a very unique history in that Brazil changed from a colony to an independent empire, from a monarchy to a republic, from a slave-holding society to a free one, without violence, without perhaps significant violence. There was some violence, certainly. In addition to this peaceful evolution, which is unusual compared to not only the rest of Latin America, but the entire third world, where there were very bloody revolutions fought over the issue of independence and slavery. In addition to this unique factor, Brazil is a good example of a multiracial, harmonious society, in that within the country, Europeans, Africans, and Indians have relatively, and I stress relatively, blended into one society, where there is certainly racial problems and certainly discrimination and so forth, but compared to other countries, the cultures, the races have had more cooperation and less antagonism among them. Brazilians are generally an optimistic people. Now, that's a general statement, but that's the opinion of at least one writer. Despite the fact that there's very high illiteracy, half the people cannot read. Poverty is very extreme. There's been very little of a democratic tradition, certainly in recent decades, with the military having a dictatorship, at least on the national level. Despite these three factors, progress is being made. Regional elections have been held recently, and there seems to be a move toward eliminating illiteracy and raising the standard of living as the economy has developed. Now, when I mentioned the title of this discussion today, I said the Afro-Indo-Portuguese history of Brazil. And when I said Portuguese, we learned that Portugal played a part in the history of Brazil. And indeed, Portugal was the mother country at one time. Brazil was a colony of Brazil. I beg your pardon, Brazil was a colony of Portugal for many, many years. And for Portugal, Brazil was the largest colonizing effort that she made in all of her colonies. Brazil is the 5th largest country in the world, behind the Soviet Union, the United States, China, and one other country. I'm not sure which. Perhaps perhaps India. I'm not sure. Most of the people in Brazil live on the coastline, as I was saying. With the advantages of living on the coast are very obvious. Ships would arrive from Europe and bringing goods, and also picking up goods which were produced in the colony. And Brazil really is somewhat of an island in many ways, in that it's surrounded by water on the north and the east parts, and on the western and southwestern area there's a lot of jungle from the Amazon River. So and that's, in some ways, it's an island. The Amazon River is the largest river in volume in the entire world. The water of the Amazon River is 14 times that of the Mississippi in volume, and it's almost like a sea in some parts. The river is so wide. A good part of it's 100 feet in depth, which is very, very deep for a river. The source of the Amazon River is in the Andes Mountains, which is the major mountain chain of South America. And the Amazon River has 25,000 miles of navigable water, so much of the Amazon is used to transport goods and people from one place to another. The Amazon River is an unequaled botanical garden, in that there's a very, very wide variety of plants in this area. There are 3,000 different species of plants on a given square mile, 50 species of monkeys, countless different insects, birds, reptiles, and fish. Now, I've discussed some of the geography. Now on to the history of Brazil. At the time of the European arrival in Brazil, there were approximately 1 million Indians of various types in the area. Considering the size of Brazil, it was relatively underpopulated compared to the high density populations of Indians in Mexico and Peru. The Indians in this area were rather short, bronze-colored, with straight black hair, as most Indians have in the Americas. The first Indians to meet the Portuguese when they arrived were the Tupi people, T-U-P-I. And these people are the most important in Brazilian history. They had developed warfare, were somewhat of a warring Indian people. They used the bow and arrow, spear, club, and the blowgun. But they had no guns. The blowgun, in other words, a blowgun is they blow these little darts through a tube, maybe a bamboo tube, and poison their opponents. The Tupi utilized slash and burn agriculture, which I mentioned, moving from one place to another as the soil became depleted. Manioc was the principal food of these people, as well as corn, beans, yams, peppers, squash, sweet potato. They smoked tobacco and enjoyed pineapples for dessert, presumably. The men hunted monkeys, the armadillos, birds, and they fished in the streams and rivers using arrows, a bow and arrow to strike the fish, as well as baskets to catch the fish swimming by. They wore little clothing, as little clothing was required with the very, very hot climate. So they were generally nude. They ornamented their bodies, they painted their bodies in religious, in drawings that had religious significance. They were they were fairly primitive people. They were not like the Aztecs who had developed cities. They had no stone tools, they didn't have the wheel, and they didn't have writing, so that we could really know more about them, because we really don't know much about these people. Now, in the 15th century, the 1400s, Portugal became Europe's biggest sea power. Now, Portugal is a neighbor of Spain, sharing the Iberian Peninsula. And it was very obvious, or perhaps expedient, that the Portuguese become seamen, as well as the British did somewhat later, because they were on the ocean and on the furthest western part of Europe. Prince Henry, who was the Portuguese king, was very much in favor of pushing sea navigation. He sponsored voyages down south to Africa and along the African coast. And at that time there was an improvement in the navigational knowledge and technology of the ships, so that they could the ships were constructed in a way which was new, so that they could tack. Now, if you know anything about sailing, you know that if you go from one place to another, it's not like driving a car. You've got to sail perhaps in one direction, and then when you come back, you zigzag to come back, which is called a tack. And the problem is that the Portuguese and other Europeans sailing down the African coast, they had a wind behind them, but they had trouble coming back, so they never went very far for fear that they would not be able to return to Europe. Now, at this time, the technology was made known so that the tacks could be shorter coming back, so they wouldn't have to take such wide tacks going back up the coast. In 1488, the Portuguese rounded the Cape of Good Hope down in South Africa, and they were trying to find a route to India so they could trade with India. 11 years later, Vasco da Gama was the first European to travel south beyond the Cape of Good Hope and to India. At that time, Portugal was establishing a commercial empire in Africa as well as Asia, i.e. India and China. They were not interested in settlement per se. They became administrators in some towns, some seaports in India as well as China. And they displaced the Arab Muslim traders in the area to take over the trade of India and China. In 1500, Portugal accidentally discovered Brazil. Now you could say, well, how did this happen? Pedro Alvarez Cabral was the captain of a 13-ship fleet, which included 1,200 men who were on a voyage, a trading voyage to India, when their vessel was blown off course as they sailed southward along the West African coast, and they landed in Brazil. Now, if you look at the map, it would be not that hard to happen, because Brazil and West Africa are really not that far apart, although it's not very apparent if you just think about it. They named the area that they arrived to Brazil, because there was an abundance of Brazil wood. And Brazil wood is what they used as a source of red dye for clothing and other textiles and so forth. The first settlers of Brazil, among them there were many criminals who were exiled, undesirables in Brazil, as the British did with Australia, deserters and from the Navy. And a lot of them they mingled with the Indians, lived among the Indians, and lived kind of a natural life. By 1600, there were 100 ships a year were bringing dye wood back to Portugal. In 1532, the first permanent colonists settled Brazil. The land was allotted in very large tracts to noble Portuguese, and these large tracts of land became sugar plantations. Later, in the interior, there were huge cattle ranches formed, and this allotment of very large tracts really hindered Brazil's growth economically, because individuals would have, there were a small number of individuals who had large tracts of land who were not really utilizing it for whatever reason. They didn't need the income, but they were not cultivating or somehow using this land, whereas there were many very poor industrious Portuguese who didn't have money and therefore didn't have the land, but who were willing to work. At first, the Indians, they were very reluctant and unreliable traders, and not very interested in the commercial interests of the Portuguese. Brazil's sugar production began the economic colonial procedure in Brazil. Sugar was cultivated for the first time in the New World in Brazil. The Portuguese used Indian laborers, and which were not very suitable, because many of the Indians, as in all of the Americas, died from the diseases which they had no immunity to, which the Europeans brought with them, including smallpox and measles and so forth, and they just died like flies. There were a lot of Jesuits who arrived with Portuguese Jesuit priests who worked on converting the Indians to Catholicism. In the north, in the 16th century, there were the French, British, and Dutch were creating the three Guianas, and they gouged small pieces away from Brazil. The Portuguese adapted very well to Brazil, considering the total change of environment that they experienced. There were very few women in the early years, so that many unions were formed between Portuguese men and Indian women, and the mestizos race was created, which was a mixed race of European and Indians. The Portuguese learned from the Indians how to survive in the new climate, how to hunt, how to fish, some of their agricultural techniques. They learned about the hammock, which became very important, so that different insects and reptiles would not be joining the sleeping Portuguese in their slumber. So they were dependent on the Indians in the early years. There was a struggle at this time. The planters, the men who became landowners in Brazil, wanted to make the Indians slaves, while the Jesuits fought this and thought this was not morally right. As I said, many of the Indians died, some due to overwork and a lot due to disease. So it was apparent they were losing their labor supply. What little they had, they needed more labor. And that's where African slavery came in. From 1550 to 1850, 300 years, there was the forced migration of African slaves from the west coast of Africa to Brazil. Portuguese traded with Africans they traded tobacco, sugar, manioc, beans, flour, liquor, and cloth for the slaves. They paid for the slaves. The slave trade between Angola and Brazil became so extensive that Angola became dependent on these slave-related imports for their economy. A total of 3.5 million slaves survived the voyage, and I say survived the voyage to Brazil. In the 16th century, 100,000 slaves arrived. The next century, the 17th, 600,000 slaves were imported. The 18th century, 1.3 million slaves. And the 19th century, 1.6 million. The types of Africans brought over were Yorubas. From the Guinea coast, there were the Sudanese, Hausas, which were a Muslim Bantu people. The Negro, the African laborers performed a variety of tasks, and among which were many skilled activities of carpenter, painter, mason, locksmith, tailor, so forth. The conquest and settlement and development of Brazil can fairly be said to be an Afro-European venture. Both Africans and Europeans were the twin forces which created what we call Brazil today. As I mentioned, there was the creation of the mestizo race, as well the mulatto population grew, which was also a new race. And the mulattoes were the offspring of primarily Portuguese fathers and African mothers. The inland expansion during the colonial period, many cowboy types emerged. Gold mining in the interior, diamonds, and so forth. Throughout the colonial period, the economy shifted from one heavy dependence on one item to another, and this shift was from Brazil wood to sugar to tobacco, cotton, cacao, rubber, to coffee. In the period of 1550 to 1650, 100 years, Brazil supplied Europe with almost all of its sugar. In 1600, 65 million pounds of sugar were produced a year, and which provided the Portuguese Empire with the majority of its income. Now, in the years following that, from 1650 to 1750, there was a 2/3 of a decline in the production of sugar because of the competition in the Caribbean of Saint-Domingue, the French, sugar cultivation, as well as the British in Jamaica, who were growing sugar and competing with Brazil. In the colonial period, sugar provided for 3/5 of Brazil's income over the entire span. In 1695, gold fever set in, and boom towns were created near the mining areas. In the 18th century, Brazil produced 80% of the world's supply of gold. But this did little to develop Brazil, as most of the gold ended up in British hands after the Portuguese bought British goods. Some would say that gold added to the impoverishment of Brazil and Portugal, as prices were inflated and the economy declined. Sort of like a paper house, you might say. The capital shifted in 1763 from Salvador to Rio de Janeiro, and that was following the gold. The capital changes basically. The capital of Brazil would move from wherever the economic reliance was placed. In the colonial period, the sugar was cultivated in the northeast. In the southeast, there was the gold mines. The cattle drives united these two areas, and which had a lot of division between them. Brazil existed for the benefit of Portugal as any good colony, so that Portugal discouraged industries which would compete with Portuguese goods. So therefore, one of the inherent impoverishing qualities of colonialism is that the mother countries will put tariffs on the import of goods, manufactured goods, from the colonies, which would inhibit the industrialization of the colonies, and one of the legacies which the Third World still lives with today. Okay, now we'll discuss the independence period. In 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte, that is, of France, invaded Portugal, and the Portuguese royal court at that time decided to flee to Brazil, and King João and the royal family did just that. They arrived the following year, and the decision was made to open the ports of Brazil to trade with the entire world, ending the Portuguese monopoly. And this is another feature of colonialism, is the trading monopoly, which the mother country will force on their colonies. In other words, the colonies are not generally permitted to trade among each other or with other European countries. And at that time, Great Britain replaced Portugal as Brazil's primary trading partner, as the British supplied cheaper, superior goods. In 1821, after the defeat of Napoleon, King João returned to Lisbon, Portugal. And his son Pedro became his regent in his absence. At that time, Portugal tried to reassert her dominance over Brazil, and the Brazilians revolted. Pedro declared independence in 1822. And this is the independence for Brazil. Now, they had a king, King Pedro. Brazil did not fragment this time as the Spanish American colonies did. One country stayed together. There was not the problem of legitimacy of power, as everyone recognized Pedro as the king of Brazil. And the United States was the first country to recognize the independent empire of Brazil. In 1828, Brazil went to war with Argentina over in the southern part, and a compromise was created, whereas the independent country of Uruguay was established as a buffer state between the two superpowers of Brazil and Argentina. In 1831, Pedro, who had been of Portuguese birth, resigned or stepped down. He went back to Portugal, and leaving his son, Pedro II, on the Brazilian throne. Pedro I was resented because he was Portuguese and not accepted as a Brazilian. So Pedro I achieved independence bloodlessly. As I mentioned, there was no war of independence in this time. In the following years, there were provincial revolts from time to time against the authority of Pedro II. He became the emperor at age 15 in a period of great chaos, and he restored the order and tranquility. At this time, coffee had displaced sugar as the major export, as the Brazilian sugar could not compete with Caribbean sugar. By 1851, the slave trade had been stopped, partially because of external pressure, among which was the British were pressuring to end the slave trade. At that time, Rio de Janeiro was the largest South American city with 250,000 people. Throughout the 19th century, European immigrants began to steadily increase their immigration into into Brazil, and these European immigrants were developing the coffee industry, which became a wage labor, or rather a labor-related industry, as opposed to sugar, which was a slave-related industry. The foreign trade, the economy boomed really in the latter part of the century, mainly due to the coffee production. After the when the United States had its Civil War and could no longer supply the needed cotton for European textile mills, Brazil picked up the slack and cotton became a major economic item. Rubber as well became part of the economy significantly. After 1870, the United States replaced England as the major trading partner of Brazil with the rise of the United States economy. The telegraph became a part of the communication system in 1852, a part of the communications revolution that hit the entire world. Railroads, steamships were a part of the transportation revolution. Textiles were the first industry, first part of the industrialization of Brazil. And indeed, textiles were what the beginning of the British Industrial Revolution, centuries earlier. Now, in the 20th century, as I said, Brazil has been experiencing economic fluctuations, periods of great economic growth. But the democratic traditions have not worked out as well as could be hoped for. Nowadays, I was just reading the other day, the inflation rate of Brazil is at 1,000% per year today, which is very devastating. It would have to be devastating to the people. The military is in control of the federal government, although they're trying to ease their control over the government as the regional elections were held last year. And they've promised, and who knows if they'll hold their promise, that they will eventually give up power to the civilians. The cities have been growing dramatically. Sao Paulo is just growing by leaps and bounds. Got a lot of shanty towns, but and they're experiencing many of the problems that the United States has had with pollution and overcrowding of the cities and unemployment. So, as I said, the things to remember. What should we remember when we think of Brazil? And what I'd like you to take home with you today. When you think of Brazil, you think of coffee. I'm sure you've already thought of that. You should think of Portuguese, because they don't speak Spanish in Brazil. They're a Portuguese-speaking country. A very heavy African influenced country. Many black people, and the African culture has really been a very significant part of what could be considered Brazilian culture today. The Indians are probably as significant there as they are here, not terribly, as far as the overall society. Many people consider Brazil to be one of the future, one of the rising stars in the third world. Now, many of the third world countries could be considered perhaps basket cases, and people think they'll never develop. Brazil has developed. It remains to be seen whether Brazil can provide employment for all of her people, whether the industrialization can continue. Brazil has a terrible national debt to the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and so forth. They've instituted the proverbial austerity measures to lower the inflation, to cut imports, and to pay their debt. It remains to be seen how the economy will perform in years to come. Um, it remains to be seen whether the military will step out of politics and whether democracy will flourish in Brazil. Um, but it's a very fascinating country, and something to keep an eye on in the news. If you see a story in the news, it's certainly an increasingly influential country as its industries develop. Many Americans go down to Brazil for Carnival, in the Lenten Carnival, which in this country is in New Orleans is called Mardi Gras, and it's at the same time right before Lent. And that's what a lot of people think of when they think of Brazil. I want to thank you for being a very attentive audience today, and we will speak with you shortly. Thank you. Well, that concludes today's presentation. Good luck to you with your efforts in studying history, and you might consider making a history video of yourself. You look at stuff that I do, you think, well, hey, look at that guy. I can do better than that. You probably can, and so just pick a topic and then put it out there. And you might not get a lot of views, but it's fun to contribute to history, the teaching of history. So thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.